What is going on, all you awesome superhero aficionados? I'm Spider Man with my co host Jimmy. And today we have a very exciting episode. We're going to kind of break the mold of how we usually do our episodes. And we wanted to do something that was fun and break away from what we normally do, like we had said. So we're going to do all things Halloween this episode. So this is a pretty exciting topic to cover. And it's something that I had done this extremely last minute where I just hit up the guys. I was like, hey, why don't we do a Halloween special and kind of just do a little bit of a break and have something that's a little different. And because, too, we're trying to do things more around certain holidays and around certain aspects. So I think it is very fitting and there's a lot of stuff to pull from. But first of all, make sure we wish you guys all a happy Halloween and hope that it's enjoyable and you guys get a lot of delicious candy and not too much though. Obviously for me, I'm trying to watch all of this right now. I know Jimmy is probably going to be collecting all the Butterfingers and all the Snickers and
Oh
all the
no,
good stuff tonight.
today's my last day. I'm actually trying a new diet out tomorrow. Not a diet, but
Okay.
I've been going to the gym for a while and I need to start committing to eating right and not just the protein and the health and the strength. I'm trying to actually change that tomorrow.
So for Jimmy, it's actually going to be Halloween year round because he's going to be trying to attain to that superhero body. So he's trying to trick his mind, be like, it's always Halloween. So that way he gives up on all that cake and all that fast food and all that.
My favorite,
all that good food.
My favorite character, Batman. What's one of the things he's most known for? It's discipline.
Exactly.
Discipline. So I got to.
Well, on top of many other things. But we don't have. I have like
purposes.
I have like a million things there that Batman is known for, but of course we don't have that time of day, unfortunately.
But for my purposes, discipline is what I would
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So let's get straight into it because I feel like, and I think the reason that I really wanted to do this was because you don't really see a whole lot of prevalence among the superhero community relating to Halloween, which is kind of ironic, like you had mentioned earlier. But so I kind of wanted to do something to where we discuss our favorite superhero stories and make a list of recommendations for people because I feel like a lot of people aren't exactly aware of how prevalent it could be and how grandstanding it could also be. So let's get to you first. What is your favorite superhero story revolving Halloween?
Well, the most obvious is Batman: The Long Halloween because that takes place from Halloween to Halloween. It has elements of horror. It's spooky. And like I was saying before we started this podcast, I think of all the superheroes, Batman is probably the one of the mainstream superheroes. We could talk about Ghost Rider and Spawn. Not that they're not mainstream, but for like the heavy hitters, I think.
You're talking. I mean, like we said too, Batman is his own brand, and Batman doesn't need any association with DC to like get that, or like when you think of like Guardians, that had to be under the MCU brand in order for it to get as popular as it was, or for to get people as interested as it was. But Batman is his own brand essentially.
Yeah, he lends himself to horror. So if you like The Long Halloween, since that's such an obvious choice, I think what people should check out if you really enjoy that story, if you enjoy the comic book or that awesome movie, it's on HBO Max right now, the 2-part Long Halloween. Check it out. Mm-hmm. I would recommend reading Batman Haunted Knight. This was from 1996. Mm-hmm. This is Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, the writer-artist team that gave us The Long Halloween. They actually created this before they did The Long Halloween, and The Long Halloween was because of the popularity of Haunted Knight. It's basically 3 different Batman stories. They're collected together as a graphic novel. Each one revolves around a different kind of villain. So the first story is Madness, and it revolves around Two-Face. Hold on one second. I apologize. The first story is Fears. I apologize. And it revolves around the Scarecrow. Fear plays a big part in the first story. And obviously, the Scarecrow is a total Halloween villain. Everything about 100% Halloween. Fear, the look, the costume. It's a perfect Halloween costume, and it really lends itself to horror. So Batman facing off against Scarecrow is great. Madness is a really good story. It's about Barbara Gordon being kidnapped as a child by the Mad Hatter and being forced to participate in a tea party with other children before Batman and Gordon save her. So that's a pretty horrifying story about kidnapped children. Goes to really dark places. And then, of course, there is Ghost, which I know this is a Halloween story, but it's based somewhat on A Christmas Carol, where the three spirits are Poison Ivy as the ghost of Christmas past, the Joker as the ghost of Christmas present, and the Grim Reaper, who turns out to be Batman himself at the ghost of Christmas future.
Oh, well, we didn't
And
see that coming, right?
yeah. And the message behind it is that these ghosts are trying to tell Batman, don't let Batman take over your life. Like, try to like find other, other fulfillment out of life. So between, I'd recommend Haunted Night. That's a great horror comic book for Batman. Another one we could get into, I'm sure, I don't know if you've read this. I don't think you've read this, is Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth.
No. I read Living Hell, actually. I haven't read that one yet, which I think I mistook for A Serious House and Serious Earth just because of the similarities and the parallels between it. But that's definitely high on my list. Obviously, Grant Morrison, we've talked about how great he is and how influential of a comic book writer he is. So he wrote that, and it's just one of the better ones. It really goes to show that you can have so many different elements of Batman and it could fit the character. Well, I mean, Batman is not really in it either, right? Because it's obviously more about Arkham.
It is. He's in it, but the way that he's drawn in here is more of like a shadow, like the silhouette of Batman lurking around. If you just flip open that comic book, anybody who flips open Arkham Asylum and you just glance at the artwork, the way that the Joker's drawn, the way that the Mad Hatter is drawn, the way that Two-Face is drawn, it's effing horrifying. It's one of the scariest looking comic books I've ever seen. Just the artwork is enough to get inside your head. It tells two different stories. It's about the inmates inviting all the Arkham inmates, taking the staff hostage and inviting Batman to come in and kind of look at them. And their point is they're trying to prove that he's no different than they are. And it also tells the story of Amadeus Arkham, who founded Arkham Asylum and eventually became an inmate there after one of his patients escaped, murdered his wife and daughter. Horrifying scene. He comes home to find his daughter's head in her in her little toy set. So that's a really good horror Halloween read for Batman. I feel there's like a lot of stories. I've never read what Gotham by Gaslight is based on, but I want to say if you want to watch a good Batman animated horror movie, you should check out Gotham by Gaslight. It's
him trying to find Jack the Ripper and going after Jack the Ripper.
So it's basically a horror animated film because it revolves around Jack the Ripper, and it really takes advantage of Batman's detective side because obviously, and it takes place in London, like in the 18th
Victorian London during that time frame or something. Yeah.
And what's weird about it is Batman actually makes a lot of sense in that time. Like what he does, how he operates, it kind of really.
We like a Sherlock Holmes kind of type, which is obviously one of his inspirations.
Yeah, Sherlock Holmes is a big inspiration on Batman, so I would check out one of those. If you want to get beyond Batman, there are some. I think there's a rich history of horror comics that a lot of fans are not really aware of. All right, so EC Comics used to publish Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear. Obviously, Tales from the Crypt is iconic because it was adapted into that HBO series with the Crypt Keeper. But it started off as a comic book series, and almost every episode is based on either an issue of Tales from the Crypt or Vault of Horror or The Haunt of Fear. They're kind of collected now. You could buy them online, like collected, like trade paperbacks. Those are really good. And I feel like a lot of comic book fans forget today that horror used to be one of the big things in comic books, maybe not some more. But that, along with a lot of the superhero stuff in the 1950s, is what led to a lot of controversy about superheroes and comic books in the 1950s. Swamp Thing is another great one.
Swamp Thing.
And of course, The Walking Dead, which is one of the biggest things. Which, even though that's horror, I wouldn't call that a superhero comic book. It's definitely a comic book about heroes, and I would say it kind of dips its toe into what superhero comics represent without ever going full on superhero. More like everyday heroes who are relatable, but very horror, obviously, because of the zombie theme going on. Spawn comics, obviously. Spawn is a creature from hell. Demons, so that obviously lends itself to horror. And of course, The Crow, which is probably one of the biggest Halloween classics.
Yeah, that's.
But yeah,
definitely.
It's a weird thing because I was mentioning before the podcast started is that there's not a lot of Halloween associated stuff with comic books, but ironically, Halloween, aside from Comic-Con and cosplayers, that's when you see the most people dressed up as superheroes. You see
Yeah.
more Batman,
Right.
Spider-Man, more Iron Mans, a lot of Captain Americas coming out.
Yeah.
So, like, I think even it's a little underrepresented sometimes, but I think there is a rich history of horror in
Definitely.
comic books and comic book
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah. We're gonna get to that. I kind of wanted to give a little bit of my own recommendations
I'm
for
sorry.
what I feel like was the it's like quintessential superhero story or and it's what is related to superhero culture during Halloween. So for me, I definitely love to replay Arkham Asylum. I think out of all of the Arkham games, it's got to be the closest to horror, and there's a lot of unsettling, a lot of disturbing elements written into it. And you can definitely tell that Paul Dini was heavily inspired by Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, and Arkham Living Hell. Because a lot of it really goes into the history on Arkham, and Amadeus Arkham talks about Mad Dog killing his family, trying to treat him, and then him dying mysteriously under electroshock, and him being admitted to Arkham and the place that he had founded, which is kind of and the whole spirit of Amadeus Arkham actually is a little side story in the game too. But there's just a lot of unsettlingness, a lot of disturbingness, a lot of and scarecrows actually when you're dosed with a heavy saturation of scarecrow spirit toxin, and it's definitely one of the probably most prevalent horror elements in the game, and it is really cool to see, and it's probably one of like the best boss fights in the Arkham game. So I think when you have those in mind, and you think, and me too, because growing up, anything associated with when you saw Arkham in the show and you saw Arkham in the media, you really were like, wow, there's a lot of potential there to do really cool things with horror, or have things go off into a horror kind of element and have that break away from kind of what a traditional superhero story is. And I think when you take into the fact that Batman is surrounded all night with insanes and a lot of his rogue galleries, and a lot of it is very claustrophobic and it's centered
I
in
think
closed spaces.
I think a lot of Batman's villains would make great horror movie villains, and I think that's
Oh
another
yeah.
thing. And then I think the fact that Batman operates off of fear, which is why he chooses a bat outfit, which we kind of associate in pop culture with vampires and creatures of the night. Even though Batman is a good character, he likes to use the aesthetics of darkness and evil to somewhat get his points across. Joker, a lot of his stories are horrifying. He could be straight out a horror movie villain. I think a lot of the Killing Joke plays like a horror movie, and like the way that the story plays out. Scarecrow is obviously another one. Mad Hatter, when he's done a certain way, is very creepy. That's a horror movie villain.
Or
Two-Face,
the Riddler, you can have the
the
Riddler
Riddler.
even doing kind of like a Saw, kind of
Yeah.
like a Jigsaw
Jigsaw
killer kind
type
of
of
like
things,
villain.
yeah. But I think his Rogues Gallery is the one that most feels horror related, and because Batman is a creature of the night. And I think that relates to why we don't see as much. I think it's harder to do Superman as horror than it is something like Batman, because Superman is bright.
Exactly.
His stories take place in the daytime. He's red, he's
Mhm.
blue, he's positive, he's optimistic, he's sunny. Superman doesn't brood. I mean, unless he's in Snyder's version, but for the most part, he doesn't really brood.
Exactly.
Um,
And
I
I
think,
wanted to get to just one more recommendation too, so I wasn't
go ahead.
completely done. But I really like The Crow too, and you had mentioned that. But it definitely more in the comic two and the book, I would definitely recommend people, and that's probably something that we're gonna have to cover where we'll dive deep into the graphic novel, because there are little changes from the movie and little subtle differences. But overall, I feel like it captures the spirit of what the graphic novel is. But obviously, because it takes place on Devil's Night, the night before Halloween, and there's excessive brooding, especially in the graphic novel, where whenever he's not committing acts of incredible violence, Eric is sulking in his old residence where he had shared with his ex-wife, I'm sorry, his fiance, and he thinks on a lot of those memories, and there's a lot of pain, anger, despair, and misery, and a lot of that really leans itself into those kind of horror elements. I won't say there's things that immediately associated, like I don't think it's a terrifying one of those ones that's going to get you scared, but just because it sets that mood and establishes that tone that is associated with Halloween. I even think one of the best scenes that we see in that is in the movie where Eric Eric escapes the cops and he's kind of taking a moment to breathe, and all the kids in Halloween and costumes, they come and run around him, and you see him like smiling and laughing with him. And I think that's kind of like one of the cool things about that movie too, is that you see him kind of just, even though he's gone through this horrible tragedy and he's on this mission, this quest of revenge, you see him kind of have this moment of where he's essentially just human around these kids. So that part is really cool to see, and you get to experience just that joy of what it was like being a kid and being on Halloween during that time, and just having that little break from all of that pain and all of that anger and all that misery associated with the story and associated with coming to the realization of what happened to you and what you need to do. I think that's just a really cool thing that we have, like kind of like that really I think that's a moment that stands out for me. But other recommendations I want to make to people, obviously we talked about The Long Halloween. You can also, if you got, these are going to be obviously reading recommendations. So we have Batman The Long Halloween. We have Blackest Night, which is essentially DC's version of zombies with the Black Lanterns. Marvel Zombies, obviously that's a given. Hellboy is obviously because he's a demon, and a lot of the stories revolve around paranormal and supernatural.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, you're right. I'm just agreeing with you. Yeah, because it's hell, so that's another obvious, like Spawn.
Exactly. The immortal Hulk, because we see the Hulk acting much different than we're used to, with Banner losing complete control, and it feels more like a classic horror film. So I definitely recommend The Immortal Hulk. Sandman, even though a lot of what revolves around Sandman isn't associated with horror, and there's not exactly scary elements, but a lot of those supernatural elements associated with this, and a lot of mythological and otherworldly territories, a lot of it really feels like it's a good read for horror, for Halloween. And obviously we had mentioned The Walking Dead, so those are some of my recommendations for you guys who are
Did we
looking
mention Swamp Thing yet?
Yeah, you mentioned Swamp Thing.
Oh, I didn't know if I mentioned Swamp Thing. That's obviously another big one. Interestingly enough, I don't think it's to the same extent, but Who You Are Today, Spider-Man, has, I think, some horror elements injected in there. I think, for one, spiders are horrifying, like bats, and they're associated with a certain thing in pop culture that's kind of menacing. So Spider-Man already has kind of a creepy moniker. If you didn't know what Spider-Man was, let's be honest, if Spider-Man didn't exist in pop culture as we know it, and you heard they're going to make a movie called Spider-Man, you'd probably think it's horror, or you think it's about somebody who's like a hybrid tarantula or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Some of his villains, Carnage,
Green Goblin. Green Goblin and Carnage got to definitely top that list. Venom, obviously, because he's created by Todd McFarlane, but the aesthetic. But I think that Spider-Man has a couple of villains, like particularly Carnage, though, that really lend themselves to horror, which makes the Venom movies a little bit more disappointing, because I actually think the Venom movies should be a lot more menacing than they are, less goofy and a lot more menacing. But Spider-Man kind of lends itself to horror a little bit. Definitely. But and then so further along, I think the way we wanted to wrap up this episode is why, well, you kind of touched upon that, but why do you feel that there's not more prevalence around superhero stories with Halloween? Even though, like you said, it's very ironic. Like a lot of the dressing up and a lot of the villains, a lot of it feels like a Halloween gimmick, but we don't see more prevalence. You see more superheroes associated with stories like with holidays like Christmas.
I think it's really, really hard for writers to do good superhero stories on Halloween, because I think a part of a big essence of what people like about superheroes is the positivity. And I think a lot of times
the hopefulness that they inspire.
Yeah, hopefulness, what they inspire. You want to see good triumph over evil when you see like a good superhero story. You want to see good overcome the bad. I mean, obviously, darkness is a part of superhero stories, because you can't have heroes if there's not darkness in the world, or if there's not evil going on. But I think that the overriding thing with superheroes is hope and inspiration. And horror is a lot more about despair and scaring the shit out of you. And sometimes those
terror, frightening.
Terror. Those things are not always compatible. Where maybe some of the villains might have some of those qualities. These stories you're meant to identify with the heroes. You're meant to see yourself in the heroes. You're meant to be inspired by the heroes. And I think that's what makes it hard. So you have to have a character like Ghost Rider, Spawn, Batman,
Blade.
Daredevil, Uh,
Oh yeah, make sure you
Blade.
guys check out Blade 1 and 2, more so Blade 2 by Guillermo del Toro, because
Yeah.
obviously that's probably really combines those elements of action and horror because that's Guillermo's, that's his MO.
Mhm. And I think a lot of those characters, I think a lot of those characters are positive characters. They're hopeful, but they use the darkness and the despair and the terror and kind of flip it on its head. I mean, the idea of Batman going out into the night, he's trying to terrorize and scare the shit out of criminals. So to criminals in the night in Gotham City, Batman is probably like a horror movie villain. When they see the light go on in the sky, I mean, they even say it in the movie, the trailer for the new movie, it's like a warning. So I think you have to bake it into like the aesthetics of the superhero in order for like the Halloween stories to work, which is why you have something like Gotham by Gaslight, the Arkham stories, all the Joker stories, and that Haunted Night graphic novel, which like the 3 horror stories, which I
Mm,
highly recommend to Batman
mm.
fans, and the Long Halloween. So it has to be put into the aesthetic of the superhero if you really want to be able to tackle horror.
Mm.
Daredevil is a big one. I think that kind of gets overshadowed and mentioned, but Daredevil too, like Batman, is a creature of the night. He's meant to be a little bit menacing, and a lot of his stories and the way that he comes out reminds me a little bit of horror movies, the way that he attacks or comes from the shadows. So it's a really difficult thing to do when you're trying to inspire hope and goodness in people, when the purpose of horror is to terrorize people and make them feel despair.
Definitely. Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that aspect because it's obvious that no one is going to make a superhero horror story, or if you would, it would be Superman without the moral code and going off the deep end
Just
and
bizarre.
him raining terror down on the public, kind of like something with Brightburn. I think that was Brightburn's attempt to do a horror Superman kind of story. And I don't really think, I think people have certain expectations, and especially just because when you have things associated with characters and characters are their own brand. It's like you're never going to see a Spider-Man story really involving horror, or it would be about him trying to apprehend Carnage or the Green Goblin, and it wouldn't. But it still would be. It still wouldn't be presented in the same way that you would have Batman. Like you could have a Batman story without him, and it could be all about horror. And I even think like Living Hell is Arkham Living Hell is one of those examples. But
Mhm.
for Spider-Man, that wouldn't really work in that same vein.
Yeah, it doesn't work. It works to an extent, but not really. And then and then you take a character like Captain America. Like that's just as an example. How do you turn that into horror? That's a really, really difficult thing. The brighter and the more hopeful the superhero is, the harder it is to delve into horror. I think it's easier with the darker ones with darker aesthetics, and the ones that brood more.
Mm.
Obviously,
Well,
brood.
especially somebody like Batman, because I mean he's the embodiment of fear,
Yeah,
and it's easy. All you would have to do was just see him from the perspective of a criminal. Obviously, a criminal is gonna see him as a horror icon, or see him
yeah.
as like a Michael Myers. Well, not exactly Michael Myers, but a would just see him as
Michael
essentially
Myers
just a
to
horror.
them.
Exactly. Well, Michael Myers to them, but
Yeah, because from their perspectives, they're not doing anything wrong, and Batman is the one swooping in to terrify them and paralyze them and take them out and ruin their way of life. But yeah, so
so, do you think going forward we'll see more risks associated with superheroes in pop culture? Like, we'll be getting more horror, horror movie or horror stories revolving superheroes? Like, essentially, like with Spawn, the new Spawn movie that Todd McFarlane is going to be directing with Jamie Foxx. He had talked in detail that he wanted to make it include more of those elements of horror and not have it be a straightforward superhero action story.
I think as time goes on and we see, and I think we're already seeing a shift of it, like we're expanding the possibilities of what superhero storytelling is now, especially with movies and television. And the way that a lot of like side characters are like starting to get spin-offs and get their own, like where superhero culture is so mainstream, it's not just like the mainstream heroes that get their own franchises and their own media. I think that at the further we delve into all the different corners of superhero culture, the more horror that we're going to see, especially as it seems to be a thing. They want to make more shows about villains these days and movies about villains. It seems to be a more of a popular thing to make a Joker film, a Venom film, a Penguin series, that at some point it's going to darken up the genre a little bit the more we see villains become the main characters of certain narratives, whether they're television or whether they're movies. I actually predict it happening a little bit more in television than in film than in movies, because I think there's a lot more freedom to do things there like that. So I
A lot
think
less restrictions.
a lot less restrictions. And I think that there's a bigger audience for dark entertainment in television than there is for films these days.
Yeah, you're 100% right.
So I think we'll see more of it going forward. And as it is, that new the Batman, the Matt Reeves one, it has elements of horror. The way that the way that it looks from what I've seen of it and from some of the previews, I wouldn't say it looks like a horror movie, but it looks like it definitely takes inspiration from horror. And it seems like their Joker is going to be more.
Riddler?
I mean, yeah. Why did I say the Joker?
It's all good.
Mistake. Their Riddler seems to remind me a little bit of like John Doe
The Zodiac Killer.
Seven, or the Zodiac Killer or something
Mhm.
like that. The way the leaving messages and the murders and stuff like that. So
Even just the way they present Batman too, it seems like they're going to present him as more that terrifying force and that
mhm,
embodiment of fear, more so than we've seen him before.
yeah. So
And heck, I mean, you even see this with Catwoman. Catwoman like flinching a little bit when she just sees him just beating Riddler and like nearly to death, or nearly just really going ham on Riddler during that time. You see her kind of like flinch and be taken aback a little bit.
yeah. So I think we're going to see a lot more of it going forward. I think in superhero culture, lightness is always going to reign supreme. And I think it comes with the nature of what superheroes are. But the more we delve into villains, and from what I understand, they're going to make a Sandman series pretty soon.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, so the more that we get into like adapting those types of stories, like the Neil Gaiman stuff and a lot of Alan Moore stuff. From Hell, that's another one. That's another comic book that's about Jack the Ripper. They adapted into a movie with Johnny Depp. I think the more that we get into like the side characters and all that, we're going to see a lot more horror-based things and horror coming out in
Yeah,
superhero genre.
yeah, which would be really cool to see, and I think that's why I'm really excited to see what happens in the future with it, because it'll just be a break from what we're used to seeing now, and I think it'll be a good way for it to. You're not going to completely stop it, but it'll be a great way to postpone that superhero bubble from exploding at some point. I think it'll be a good way to prolong
Give
it and
more
get new
variety.
stories in. Yeah, it'd be good for variety's sake. And there's interesting characters who have good stories to tell and have a sizable audience and can definitely have a good fan base for them. It's just a matter of them kind of getting out there in the open
I mean,
and being able to see good results with it.
Constantine is another one, and when they finally
Constantine, yeah.
do a new Constantine, that's going to have to delve heavily into horror elements. And I'll admit, I'm not familiar with this. The show Preacher that was on AMC is based on a horror comic book. And from what I understand, that's another example. So the more I think there's a lot of more obscure characters that are horror based in comic books than people realize.
Well, oh yeah, we're
Um,
gonna be getting Werewolf by Night as a Halloween special next year too on Disney Plus. And Werewolf by Night obviously is a Marvel character.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I really hope we get to see like Midnight Suns, because obviously those characters all revolve around horror. When you think of
Mhm.
Morbius, if you think of Ghost Rider, Werewolf by Night joins them at one point, and because of the more supernatural, mystical elements associated with the Marvel universe, Justice League Dark. I'm really hoping we get to
Justice
see
League
some
Dark
kind
is
of.
one that really that has heavy horror elements in it. In fact, those are ones that are interesting because the superheroes have the type of powers that you would expect horror movie villains to have. They're not typical superhero powers. They're kind of terrifying.
Definitely.
Things that we associate with evil or black magic in pop culture.
Exactly. Well, he gets Zatanna in there, and obviously when
Yeah,
she's, but
yeah.
so I really hope we get to see more of that, just because, like I said, it'd be a cool little break from all of just what we're used to seeing now, and it'd be cool to have some variety around there and see companies and
Mhm.
these corporations really taking their chances and giving people different things. But I know money talks, so I think that's going to be the real indicator and the real judge of whether how far they're willing
You
to go
know,
with this,
you
or
know why I
how much they're willing to experiment.
you know what I think why I think it's going to become more prevalent. You know, the all right, if you pay attention to like films lately and the box office and what rules and what dominates at the box office, most of the highest grossing films now are movies that break 50, 40, 50 million dollars on opening weekend, at least in the past couple of years, especially during the pandemic, have either been superhero movies or horror movies.
Right.
Those are the two things that are guaranteed to make money at the box office these days. They have audiences that are dedicated, and strangely enough, superhero and horror audiences have a lot of similarities.
Mm.
There's like the obsessive fanboyness that goes into it. There's conventions for both. There's like the dressing up. There's the cosplaying. Like horror fans,
Endless fan debates on whether the original is better or the
yeah,
sequel is better, or
always like,
which Jason was the best, or which
yeah,
Michael Myers was the best.
people like to argue about. I mean, think about it. Freddy versus Jason is a straight up superhero concept, to have those two characters having two titans like that. And yeah, people always wanting to debate who would win. Who would win? Would it be Freddy or would it be Chucky? Would it be Michael Myers or would it be Jason? It's the same way that people debate if Iron Man would beat Batman in a fight, or if it was Superman against Thor or anything like that. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of similarity and overlap in terms of like the fan culture that goes into both genres. And since they're the ones that are dominating in terms of what people want in terms of box office entertainment, that's why I see it kind of going together
Mm.
more in the future,
Well,
because a lot of studio execs are going to look, well, these are the two things that make the most money. If we combine them, we can get a really big audience.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Halloween Kills that did really well in the box
Yeah.
office, right?
It overperformed. People thought it was going to make like 30 million, and it made 50 million on its opening weekend while still playing for free on, well, not for free, but for playing on Peacock, where you could check it out, and still getting good streaming numbers. You think about movies like Venom that did really good. Even a couple years ago, Venom, the first Venom movie and Halloween 2018 both came out like 2 weeks apart, and their opening weekend grosses were like almost identical.
Crazy.
Like they were like almost like, I think Venom made just slightly more, but their opening, but they had almost identical grosses on opening weekend, and the same type of retention of like in the following weeks in terms of how many people go to see it in the weeks after. A
Definitely.
Quiet Place is another one that's a big thing. The Conjuring movies make a lot of money. So they're the two
Mm.
things that are guaranteed to bring studios income. The It films were really big blockbusters. Even, I don't know if you saw It Chapter 2. I saw the reverse. We're talking about horror invading superhero culture. I saw superhero culture invading horror in the It movie. I kind of felt like the end or the climax of It Chapter 2, with like the big monster and where they all band together and they all put aside their differences for like a big team up, reminded me a lot of the Avengers. There's
Yeah,
elements of a horror Avengers going on with like the
definitely.
special effects and the fights. So we're already seeing it happening.
Definitely.
Oh,
What
and
about
come
like
to think of it,
what
Andy Muschietti, the director of It, his next project is a Flash movie.
oh yeah,
So I
yeah,
mean, that just
yeah.
goes to show you. Sam Raimi, there's another one who's known for horror movies and has made all
And yeah,
kinds
I
of.
was about to bring him up right now.
Oh yeah, some of the most
Well, I was about to say,
iconic.
like, because Ash is essentially a horror icon, but he's also a superhero when you think about it.
Yeah. There's actually comic books revolving around Ash from the Evil Dead, and like he is a superhero.
I
He
mean, he's
even
fought
has,
Jason and Freddy.
he's fought Jason and Freddy. Even his chainsaw hand, that's a total superhero thing to have, like a superpower like that. And he's quippy like Spider-Man. He's funny. He's goofy. He combines different elements. So I've noticed a lot of horror filmmakers, when you really stop and look at it, go into superhero films after. James Wan is another big one who did the Conjuring films and Insidious, and those were all big blockbusters. Now he's doing Aquaman, and he just
Hmm.
did another horror movie, and then he's going back to Aquaman. So we're seeing a lot of the same
Oh,
filmmakers.
James Gunn. James Gunn did Slither and Brightburn, and he will. I don't think he directed Brightburn, but I think he wrote the script. So he also has dabbled a little bit in horror, and obviously with Guardians. So it's kind of funny when you think about it. A lot of directors who are booking jobs for superhero films. A lot of them have done horror. Are really experienced and well versed in horror.
Yeah, a lot of the big ones. Like it was more than I realized when I started. There's like there's James Gunn, there's James Wan, there's Sam Raimi. It's Scott Derrickson is another one who is did Sinister and ended up doing the Doctor Strange movie. And it's
Oh,
funny.
he did.
Yeah,
He did Sinister.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. So there's quite of a lot. It's a lot of the same filmmakers working in
Hmm.
both genres now.
Well, and we'll see too, because now that we mention it, we'll see what happens with Multiverse of Madness. I think that'll be the first foray for the MCU to tackle more of those elements of horror, and I think they got probably the best director who is most suited for that. So
Hmm.
I think that's the sign of good things to come. Would hope that they take more risks with that going future in the future, and we'll see how things go.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, Sam Raimi. The Evil Dead trilogy is one of the most beloved trilogies in horror, and the Spider-Man trilogy is one of the most beloved trilogies in the superhero films. So
Right.
it seemed to be a lot of similar fan bases, and I don't think it's an accident that so many horror filmmakers end up doing superhero films after.
Right. Yeah, I don't think it is either.
Yeah,
But well, with all that being said, thank you guys so much for joining us today on our Halloween special. We wish you guys this is going to come out directly after. So we hope you guys had a very happy Halloween. Definitely check out all of our recommendations for stuff to check out and put them in your database for to check out next year during Halloween season. This is the Heroes and Mutants podcast. We will see you next time. Thank you guys so much.
signing off. We'll see you next time.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.